Hello, thank you for joining me on our webinar today, where we are going to have a look at Microsoft SharePoint, part of the Office 365 suite. My name is Simon Gammon. I'm one of the technical directors at Nexus. My areas of focus tend to be around Office 365 and Microsoft Azure, in particular working on Microsoft Teams, Power BI, and of course SharePoint. So today we're going to talk about Microsoft SharePoint. We're going to start by talking about what Microsoft SharePoint is as a product and look at how it's kind of positioned within the Microsoft 365 stack. From there, we'll move on to some core concepts around SharePoint. Sites, lists and libraries are kind of those features within the product that you can't do without. Sites will kind of, as I say, we'll go into more detail in this in later slides, but sites are kind of really how you structure your SharePoint environment. Lists and libraries will end up being your repositories for your data. So with information that's stored in SharePoint, you're going to also want to present that information through the SharePoint environment, and that will kind of take us on to talking about sort of site pages and web parts as well. Other things we'll look at is we'll discuss customizing sites and creating an experience for users. So this will take us from just starting off with a vanilla SharePoint site to creating something that's kind of maybe more reflective of an organization's identity. We'll have a chat around the permissions part of SharePoint, and then finish off just by talking about hubs, which is kind of a mechanism for kind of pulling all your various SharePoint sites together and giving it a bit more of a joined up experience. Okay, so starting with the question then, what is SharePoint? Well, SharePoint is one of the core products that makes up Microsoft Office 365. In addition to SharePoint, other products that you could argue kind of fall under this category are Microsoft Exchange and Teams. Exchange gives you your email piece within Microsoft 365. Teams gives you your collaboration and your single pane of glass on which you can interact with the Office 365 environment. And what SharePoint can give you is it gives you the sort of files and data piece of Office 365. Now, for a lot of people, if you're already using Microsoft Office 365, if you're already using Microsoft Teams, then actually you're already using SharePoint. When you work within Teams and you save files within Teams and you're sharing files from a team with other users, those files are actually stored in the Microsoft SharePoint environment. In fact, every time you create a team within Microsoft Teams, a corresponding SharePoint site gets created in the background. So the two of them are kind of strongly linked. SharePoint itself is being part of Microsoft Office 365 is hosted in Microsoft data centers. Now, in the past, SharePoint used to be an on-premise product before Office 365, and actually there are still even today versions that you can buy of it for on-premise. But something that's often been a blocker is that it's not just a straightforward case of just installing SharePoint on a box and you get running. Often it's required SQL servers, you've had to set up core SharePoint servers and application servers, and it actually you create this kind of environment called a SharePoint farm. And that sometimes has been kind of like a bit of a sort of element that's put people off. The nice thing with 365 is you have none of that. Because it's all hosted by Microsoft, it's all there up and running, and literally you can start using it from day one when you get an Office 365 subscription. So the thing with SharePoint is that, like I say, it's already being used to store files within your Teams environment, and actually that could be all SharePoint ends up being for a lot of users. It is just a file repository where they can access information, but you can do so much more with it. You can use it as your communications portal, as a internal sort of company intranet, or even potentially having a situation where you've got guests coming in and interacting with you in those portals. You can create web pages within SharePoint, so you can push out that company branding and create a kind of more sort of integrated experience with it. And SharePoint's kind of heritage also is very much in document management as well. So whereas with Teams out of the box, you'll just be kind of potentially dumping files into a SharePoint kind of library, what you can actually do with it is you can store all sorts of information with that file and then use that information to control how that document kind of flows around the SharePoint environment and ultimately get to like a sort of full-on document management system. The kind of two examples I kind of just give there are probably just a few, and actually over the course of its existence, SharePoint has been used for a whole raft of things, but you know, those give you kind of two good examples out of the box. So starting with or from Microsoft Teams, we know now that every team that you create also has its own corresponding SharePoint site, and we also know that files are stored in SharePoint. So in this example here, let's just go to the IT team, click on the general channel, and if I navigate up here to files, then what we get underneath is a list of files, and those files are stored within SharePoint. Just something else just worth noting on this screen as well, though, is that yes, users can access their SharePoint files from here, but if you look over on the right hand side, you've also got a link there that actually takes you off into SharePoint itself. So for those users that already come with that experience of using the Microsoft Teams environment, that next step of then accessing the SharePoint site that corresponds with your team is literally just one click away. From Teams then we click on the Open in SharePoint button. This then will open up Microsoft SharePoint itself in a web browser, and it will navigate you straight to a document library where your files are held. So with SharePoint then, when files are stored in SharePoint, they are stored in these repositories called document libraries that exist within your SharePoint site. By default, you'll get one document library to start with, and any files that you upload into Teams then will be stored within this document library within a folder that has the same name as the channel of your team. So here we're in the general folder. I've got like a little, I've got my list of files in there, and then up above, I've got a little breadcrumb trail that's showing that I can use to navigate back to the root of the document library. And again, you can see here that I've got two folders, one for each channel in Teams, and I can just double check that, look back in Teams, and you can see I've got my two channels there. So inside the document library where we've got our files, what you also get is metadata that you can store with these documents, and out of the box it will have a modified and modified by column. What I've also done is created a PDF test column, which what you can then do is tie into workflows. So for example, for every file that has a yes against it, maybe you've got a workflow that emails it off to someone else for a approval process. And Flow is a very, very powerful feature in Office 365 that ties into a whole number of products, including Microsoft SharePoint. So if you want to, then you've got your PDF test column, but you can also add your own custom columns in as well. And you can store columns for all kinds of information in SharePoint. So you can set this up and then make it so that you've got other information held against this against your documents. Let's move on a slide. And what we're looking at here actually is if you were just to go directly into SharePoint itself, what would happen is SharePoint would actually take you to a landing page for that site. And that landing page is created using something called site pages. So when you kind of go into Microsoft SharePoint, you get this kind of very generic template. It's created using the Microsoft Modern Design or SharePoint Modern Design, and basically in a nutshell what you've got access here to is a responsive website. So when you land on that page, obviously if you're just using Teams for files, then all you're actually going to see is just the files that you've got stored within SharePoint. But in that team, there are other things you can do as well. So on this page here, for example, it's got a news section and it's got an activity section. And what you can start doing is actually posting information into the SharePoint site for other users to kind of access. There are other parts of the SharePoint site as well, just worth mentioning briefly. You've got things like Notebook on the left-hand side, and this gives you access to Microsoft OneNote for that SharePoint. So if you want to store meeting notes and such in the SharePoint site, then yeah, you can do all that as well. And over here on the right, what we've got are documents. So actually that document library we were just looking at a minute ago, you can actually also access through the site pages as well. But the idea behind the site page is it's giving you control of the presentation of your information. So out of the box, it looks okay, and you could sort of start posting information into that. But what you can also do is you can apply a bit of branding to your SharePoint site, which kind of takes you from this to something more like this. And this is kind of where SharePoint starts to come alive a little bit. So this site that we're looking at here is a similar site. It's got document libraries in it, it's got site pages in it. But the site pages, as I mentioned, is that means by which users can kind of interact with the environment. So here we've got some kind of graphics at the top that kind of link through to various articles. We've got things like weather reports coming in, news appearing, and obviously you can provide access to document libraries and so on. And also a little bit of colouring in there as well, just to kind of put a bit of kind of corporate identity in there. Site pages can easily be changed in SharePoint. If your permissions allow, you can edit a site page, then add or remove custom components called web parts from the page. Okay, if we have a look at this page, we can see we've got a number of web parts there already. And these are just some of the standard ones that just get presented on the page. So let's add another web part in here. SharePoint comes with over 50 different web parts out of the box that allow you to surface information held either in SharePoint or from third-party sources. In addition to this, there are also other third-party web parts, or you can even create your own. Although building your own web parts does take you into the world of software development. So as you can see, there's a good few web parts that we can choose from here. Let's just go for events for now and add that onto the page. You can add a title to your web part, and there are other options you can set as well. But yeah, adding web parts, pretty straightforward. And there we go. We published the page and all is good. So just to recap briefly on site pages then. Site pages then are used to present your content from your SharePoint sites, and any one particular SharePoint can have multiple site pages in it. In fact, that's not unusual. The individual pages themselves can be customized, and you customize that layout using web parts. And as we saw, you know, you've got quite a choice of different components that you can pick from. The actual pages themselves use the modern design. So the thing to remember this is the modern design is a responsive design, a bit like it would be with a responsive website, which means that it will scale across all sorts of devices, and that obviously includes mobile devices as well. Which nicely brings us on to permissions. So when you're setting teams up within Microsoft Teams, we know we get a corresponding SharePoint site created. We also know that site now has a document library. The other thing that sort of takes place as well in this process is that when you're setting up your membership of your teams, you're deciding who's a member, who's an owner. Those permissions get passed over into SharePoint as well. So this allows for a member of a particular team to access the Files tab and get access to files and folders within that tab. So you can manage your permissions from within Microsoft Teams. What we can also do, though, is you can use SharePoint to set more advanced permissions. So what could be happening here is a scenario where maybe you want to provide some users access to your SharePoint libraries without necessarily giving them access to the conversations and information that's going on within Microsoft Teams itself. So you could go into SharePoint and actually expand the permissions for a particular library in SharePoint for those users to access. Or you may want to take it in the other direction where you've got a whole load of members of a team, but you want to minimize who gets access to certain folders because it contains more sensitive information. So SharePoint allows you to go in and set those more advanced permissions. And the other useful thing here is that over time, as permissions in a particular SharePoint site grow, you may actually from time to time want to go in there and actually see what permissions are set up. So there's the ability within SharePoint to find out what permissions a person has and how that person got those permissions. So just to show you here, just quickly some images. The easiest way to kind of hand permissions out from within SharePoint itself is you can go to a file or folder within SharePoint and you can click on the share button, and that will take you to a screen that allows you to add some usernames in and share access to that particular folder out. Or there are options to go in and actually set the permissions a little bit more at a granular level, but also go in there and actually just view what permissions are currently set up. And you can do that through the manage access options that are also sort of provided in that screen. However, if you need to go a bit further again, and using the admin side of SharePoint, you can go in there and actually see again how permissions are set up for those particular users. It gives you a little bit more control again, maybe over how those permissions are set. But more useful is there is an option actually to check permissions here. So if you've got a scenario where maybe either someone's complaining that they can't get to a particular file or folder, you could come into SharePoint and find out how those permissions are set. Or it could be the other way around. Maybe there's a concern that people are able to access a folder. So maybe you want to check the fact that those permissions are actually secured properly. And this is what check permissions allows you to do. And what's useful with this process is you also get to see how those permissions were given. So in this instance, checking permissions on me, I can see quite quickly that I've got full control and edit access. And those permissions were given by virtue of the fact that I've got membership of particular groups. The other thing with permissions in SharePoint as well is actually you can add individual users in and set permissions up for those people as well. But if you can, try and manage it through groups. It's just a lot easier to keep a handle on. Okay, so coming away from site pages then, just want to talk a little bit about lists and libraries. We encountered document libraries earlier in the presentation, and we could just see how documents filed were kind of like saved within that library, and you can create folder structures. Those folder structures mimicked your team channel structure, but you can go off and create other folders as well. We've also talked briefly about permissions, where we can see that you can set permissions up on document libraries, even on folders, even on files within that. But the other term that crops up a lot is lists. So what lists are in SharePoint is effectively they are tables containing structured data. So maybe a kind of comparison that you could consider to a list is if you went into something like Microsoft Excel and you saw tabular data in a worksheet, or if you went into a database where you've got rows and columns in that database are designed to hold specific types of data like text or numbers or dates. And lists kind of work in the same way. So if you want to kind of hold information within SharePoint, then lists is a way of doing this. So I suppose the question there would be is, well, why would you want to do that? Well, by building lists inside SharePoint, what you could do then is you could say hold, some information about a process, or maybe about a customer, or some other item of information. And then potentially what you could do is that information you could then run through things like workflows, for example. So you could track activity, a bit like with document libraries and approval processes. You could do the same thing with lists. You could make this data available through Power Apps. So people have got like an application screen that's updating data in this list. And so the idea really is that you're kind of centralizing this data better than maybe having it inside an Excel spreadsheet, because you're kind of putting it in a more sort of centralized location. But yeah, it's just a way of kind of holding data and information that you can kind of then do something with or run a process against within SharePoint itself. Something worth just mentioning just very quickly here is that the term lists and libraries are kind of used to sort of almost describe two different kinds of entity. But actually, when you look at the technology under the bonnet in SharePoint, all a library as a document library is it's just a special kind of list. It's a list that's got columns of information, but in addition to that, you can attach files to it. So really in SharePoint, there aren't lists and libraries, there's just lists, and a library is just a special kind of list. Just some things just to mention about libraries then. So your libraries then, as we saw, we could use that for the storage of files with additional columns for metadata. We know already that a new team site has a default library called documents. But just some other things just worth mentioning about libraries as well is that when you're saving files into document libraries, you've got some processes that just come out of the box with SharePoint, and you've got things like version control in there, and you've got document history in there. So if there's a scenario where, I don't know, a document has changed, maybe suddenly a bit of information could be missing from it, or something's broken in the document, what you can actually look back through is a history of changes that have been made to that document. And each time a document is saved within SharePoint, a new entry is created, and you can review that history. So at any point, one of the nice things with libraries in SharePoint is you can actually just roll back to an earlier version of document rather than maybe relying on, say, I don't know, IT having to go off and restore something from backup for you, which is quite a cool feature. Just to give you a sense of scale with how lists and libraries work, they can hold up to 30 million items. So a lot of data can go within one list or libraries. I mean, there are potential restrictions that could kick in there because it's not, you could say, for example, hit the threshold or the maximum amount of data that you could store in your tenant before you get up to 30 million items. Other things that can be gotchas around that is if you have a network drive, it's not unusual for network drives to get quite messy, and you can have situations where I don't know, you could have hundreds and hundreds or even thousands of documents in one particular folder, and when you're kind of accessing that through a network drive and scrolling down and whizzing down through them, that's not too bad. With SharePoint though, what you'll find is that if you create one folder that's got a lot of information in it, bear in mind when you're accessing SharePoint, you're accessing it through a web page. If you're having to scroll down through a lot of files, then actually the process can get quite slow and quite unwieldy. So yes, lists and libraries can hold a lot of information, but equally important though is getting the structure of those libraries right. So it's probably just a reference here to people thinking about migrating files from a network drive into SharePoint. It's not a case if you just take what's on your network and you copy it onto SharePoint itself. It's very, very important that you try and tidy up that structure while it's still on the network drive before attempting a migration into SharePoint. It's one of those things that it's easier to tidy or manage a folder structure while it's still on the network drive than it is to move it over into SharePoint and then spend a lot of time trying to fix it there. So yeah, for those thinking about migrations, tidy before you migrate, very important. But the thing is though, is that once that information is in SharePoint, a good folder structure is also helpful, but this metadata as well can be very, very important. And having ways of referencing a file other than by a file name can be very, very useful. So you could say, for example, have a cluster of files that are easily identifiable because they've got this bit of metadata that goes with them, which is some kind of reference information like a customer reference number or a customer name or something. And so when searching for files in SharePoint or trying to kind of surface this information for other users to access, you're not just relying on file names, you can actually utilize metadata to do that. Okay, so moving on to hub sites. This is a fairly recent addition to SharePoint. I think they turned up either it was earlier this year or certainly they were in preview last year. And it is a mechanism for pulling multiple sites together. So the scenario we're looking at here is, imagine you have a number of SharePoint sites in place. So maybe you've got a SharePoint site that is for the HR department. Maybe you've got a SharePoint site that is for what's going on in IT, a SharePoint site that is just general kind of company information. And you've got these various sites that are kind of scattered around that are holding bits of news, useful bits of information that you want to make accessible to people. So we've seen already you can create site pages. Talked about the fact that all this kind of ties into Teams, so that's all cool. But sometimes what you want to be able to do is kind of bring all this information together. So a hub site is a way of aggregating data from other SharePoint sites and maybe surfacing them through a single site. So this could be a case of saying, right, well, news that's going on in HR, news that's going on in IT, what we want to do is just bubble the latest news up so people don't have to click into each site in turn to see what that latest bit of news is. They can just go to our main kind of landing page in our SharePoint site and consume it from there. So what you can end up doing then is you create your various separate sites. You'll create a hub site, which initially is just an ordinary SharePoint site. It might not be linked to Teams, although we've talked predominantly in this session about SharePoint sites and how they've kind of been created by Teams. Actually, you can create SharePoint sites totally independent of Teams. You don't even need Teams at all to better use SharePoint, but it seems to be becoming the common way by which people are interacting with it. So yeah, you'd have all these sites in place. You'd create another site then that would just be a standard SharePoint site to begin with, and then you would go through a process of making this a hub site. And once you've got that hub site in place, you can then identify which sites you actually want to link to this hub. Once sites are linked to your hub site, you can then surface content from those sites within SharePoint itself, or within your kind of hub site. So I've just got a quick example here, just showing you a site that's been set up as a hub site. One of the things that we're wanting to do on this site then is we want to pull information up from our hubs, or from our subsites, sorry. And actually the process is quite straightforward. So looking at this screen, we're now seeing a site page again, so we're familiar with that term. It's got a web part on it showing news. And when you're setting these web parts up on the hub site, what you can specify, if you look over on the right, is that I want this web part to show news from all the sites in the hub, and it's simple as that. So very, very quickly, you can kind of centralize information and make it available for other users to kind of quickly consume. Okay, so I started this webinar talking about how you could go from Teams into SharePoint, and then we've just spent a little bit of time looking around and talking about the SharePoint environment itself. It probably makes sense just to kind of finish off by bringing this back into Teams. And obviously at the moment, you'll see with the Teams environment, if you're currently using it, that that you've got the Files tab, and we know now that that looks at a document library within SharePoint itself. But what you can also do within Teams is you can create additional tabs within your various channels. And it probably is just worth mentioning in this sort of final slide is that this is a way of actually bringing sort of some of the site pages from SharePoint back into Teams for those users who don't want to be kind of like accessing SharePoint by other means. And just on this example I've got here, we can see I've got a tab called SharePoint, and the news and articles that we're seeing here is a site page that I've picked out of SharePoint is being surfaced within that particular team. So you don't have to make users go off and learn other URLs or issue them links to SharePoint. You know, coming back to the probably where I was saying about Teams being the single pane of glass, well, why not surface your SharePoint pages within Microsoft Teams itself? Okay, so finishing off then, I've just got the ubiquitous licensing slide. So normally with the licensing slide, I might show you sort of a few screen grabs and such of some of the different licensing plans that you get and which plans a particular product will come with. The thing with SharePoint is that if you're on the business or enterprise plans, then you've got SharePoint already. If you're using Teams, you've got SharePoint already. I believe the only plans it doesn't come with out of the box are the home plans. So, you know, for people here today, that shouldn't affect you at all. So all of you should have SharePoint already if you're using Office 365. And if you're using Teams, you've definitely got SharePoint. Some things worth mentioning, though, is that when you get your SharePoint license out of the box, you will get 1 terabyte of storage that you can use across all your SharePoint sites. And also what you get is an additional 10 gigabytes per user. So if you've got a lot of users, then you know that number can quickly add up. If for any reason you're finding the 1 terabyte isn't enough, then you can buy more storage. And then yeah, Microsoft just add that on as an extra cost each month. As far as the editions, I mean, mainly it's, you know, you're looking at your business and your enterprise editions. So business edition, I believe you can have up to about 300 users in your SharePoint environment. When you're on the kind of e-licensing enterprise, then you can have up to 5,000 users, not 5,000, 500,000 users instead. So finishing off then, just remember, SharePoint's already there, it's just waiting to be used. You can use it to create intranets, document stores, and sort of so much more with it. It's probably one of those products that can easily pass a lot of people by, and it does have a lot of capabilities. And with SharePoint, as we saw, you can kind of bring that information sort of back into Microsoft Teams as well. So it doesn't have to be this other silo. You can create a very, very kind of integrated experience with it all. Okay, thank you everyone for your time today.
So thank you, Simon, for your presentation. We've got Simon online now to answer some questions. We've had some questions in the Q&A box, so I think it might be nice just to share some of those verbally, some of the answers to those questions with everyone. And if you've got any questions still after that, you've still time to drop them in the Q&A box, and we'll try and pick those up. So, Simon, if you can unmute your mic. I think perhaps if we can just revisit some of the questions we've had on file deletion and recovery and version control, and what kind of power you've got there in terms of getting your files back, either if they've been deleted or if they've just been modified accidentally.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, because one of the I think the questions just came up was around kind of, you know, the files being deleted going into the recycle bin, was things like, you know, can you kind of recover that from the recycle bin? And yes, you can. When you restore that file, you can also port its history back. I mean, by default with SharePoint, when you first delete a file, it will send it off to the recycle bin, and it will sit there for, and I think the default is about 30 days. And then from that point, then what happens is it goes on to a secondary recycle bin, and then retains it then for another period of time, which I believe by default is 30 days, but I think you can change that. Now, one of the questions that kind of came up, if I can just find it again, I think was just asking about setting up various kind of rules and compliance stuff, especially around things like GDPR. And I mean, it's not something I've kind of gone into for this presentation, but there are tools within Office 365 for document labeling and compliance. So, you know, for different libraries, even for certain documents going into a particular library, you may want to set up different retention rules. And there are kind of capabilities in the back end of 365 for doing that. I mean, it's something that's evolving all the time. I mean, you kind of wind the clock back 12 months and those features were probably kind of early days. But yeah, you've got a lot of control there regarding compliance within 365 itself. Just jumping around to some other questions I had. There was another question on when you're working with files in SharePoint, does it have file content search? Yeah, I mean, SharePoint has sort of built-in search features for it. Obviously, people can be looking for files by file name or actually any of the other bits of metadata. And, you know, when you put a file in, if you've got other columns of information that you're recording with that file, like for a customer reference number, all that information is searchable as well. but you can also search the content of common document types. So all your kind of different Office document types like Word, Excel and such are searchable. PDF is searchable, and there's a few other types it would do as well that I can't sort of name off the top of my head. But what you may also find is there could be some more I don't know, like esoteric file types, which when the content search is working, it wouldn't go through and necessarily search the content of those files, but definitely common Office document types and such it will as well. But yeah, when I was mentioning about metadata earlier, it's that thing of, you know, you've got your file saved in SharePoint, but you can store other columns of information alongside that file to help make it easier to identify. So yeah, like I say, the example I was using was probably something like a customer reference number, but there's no reason why you can't have kind of multiple bits of information stored with that file. And again, like I say, it works with the search thing. Probably the only caveat I would say with something like metadata is when you've got your documents in there, you probably don't want to have too many metadata fields, because if you end up having, I don't know, like 20 different metadata fields for a file, what's the odds that you're going to have a user saving a file into SharePoint and filling in all those fields? You're just making almost the product difficult for a user to get on with. So when you are looking at things like metadata and additional columns of information, I would, at least to begin with, keep it as simple as you can, just to kind of get users used to that.
Just as a practical application of that, you could have a library that had a series of contract documents in it, and the metadata files, for example, could be the review status of the contract, whether it's in draft or whether it's live, and then you could have the start and end dates of those contracts. What you can then do very easily is create views on that filter the documents in that library, for example, just to show you the contracts that are live and current at one point in time, or the ones that are about to expire, so that you can process and handle those. So it gives you an easy way to manage potentially quite large numbers of documents and filter them down to just the ones that you want to see at any one time.
Yeah, that's good. Actually, just one other question I've just seen about recommending using, what would recommend using third-party backup? Okay, so the thing with SharePoint out of the box is there's quite a bit of resilience there as it comes. So if you were having it, well, let's say if Microsoft had a situation where they had failure at their data center, actually they end up kind of storing kind of multiple copies of SharePoint or your environment, which they can kind of switch over to very quickly. So out of the box, the resilience that actually comes with SharePoint Online is pretty good. But saying that, you may still want to back up. Could be a scenario, say, where say a file's been deleted, maybe it's gone through the first recycle bin, maybe it's gone through the second recycle bin, maybe that file's been completely cleared out of SharePoint and it was a file you want to recover from sort of months ago. So potentially you may want to recover from backup then. And probably talking about recommending third-party backups, I would probably shamelessly recommend our NCC backup solution, which kind of does backups on Office 365 and includes SharePoint.
Okay, I think those are all the questions that we've had fired into the Q&A box so far. Was it worth a quick bit of covering on local syncing of libraries and how that can be used to help manage your files?
Yeah, okay, so yeah, I think what you're alluding to there is OneDrive. So obviously in the context that we've talked today, we've been looking at kind of using libraries inside SharePoint and ones that, you know, everyone's kind of going into. What you also have is your own OneDrive sync as well. And normally what that would do is that would access just the OneDrive part of Office 365 and allow you to take files that are kind of stored up in the cloud and actually have a local copy of them as well. You can also do that with SharePoint libraries. It is possible to do OneDrive sync with SharePoint libraries as well. The only caution I would throw in there is possibly for sort of some of your larger libraries, if you're putting loads and loads of files in there, although the way OneDrive sync works now is very clever in that it only downloads the files that you need to access at that point in time, although it will show you all the files when you're going into OneDrive. I would probably be cautious about using OneDrive Sync for larger libraries, but where you've got kind of small groups collaborating in teams and such. And yeah, for that sort of thing, then I think the OneDrive sync is okay.
Great. Okay, I think we've exhausted all the questions. So thanks very much, Simon, for answering those.
Yep.
I've put the details, contact details for Nexus and for Simon on screen. So if you want to follow up with any of the things that you've heard discussed today, then please do, including about SharePoint itself, licensing, or if you fancy a demo or a bit more of an in-depth discussion about how it might suit your scenario, or even NCC is Nexus Cloud Connect, which is our backup solution, which can include Office 365. Please get in touch.
That's great. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye now.
All right, bye.